Look at you, soaking wet and stumbling around. You drunk or just high, pal?
I just pulled a drowning kid out of that water. Back off.
Yeah, save the hero story. Stop resisting and turn around.
I'm not resisting. I'm catching my breath. Listen to me.
Done listening. Hands behind your back or you hit the ground.
Don't touch me. Get your sergeant down here.
The line between a hero and a suspect is often drawn not by actions but by perception. In the fading light of a Florida evening, that line became a terrifying reality for a man who had already given everything to his country, only to find himself fighting for his dignity on the very soil he had defended. This isn't just a story about a misunderstanding. It is a dissection of how quickly authority can curdle into abuse when the person wielding the badge refuses to see the humanity shivering in front of them. The water at Lowry Park was black and still reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It was a Tuesday, the kind of humid, heavy evening where the air feels like a wet towel draped over the city. Terrell Anderson sat on a concrete bench near the Riverwalk, his breathing measured, his eyes scanning the perimeter. This was his sanctuary. For Terrell, the park wasn't just a place to jog, it was a necessary decompression chamber. Terrell Anderson was a survivor. He had spent 8 years in the Marine Corps, deploying twice to regions where the sand was fine as powder, and the danger was as constant as the heat. He had come home with his body intact, but his nervous system rewired for a threat level that didn't exist in civilian Tampa. He carried the invisible weight of what he had seen, the chaos of convoys, the silence of the aftermath, and he managed it through rigorous, almost monastic discipline. He worked in logistics now, a job that required precision and quiet focus, managing supply chains for a medical distribution center. He was the guy who stayed late to ensure the inventory counts were perfect, not because he wanted overtime, but because he needed the world to make sense. Order was his anchor. Every evening at 1800 hours, he ran 5 miles. It was a ritual that burned off the excess adrenaline that tended to pool in his chest during the commute home. He wore high visibility gear, not just for safety, but because he knew that a large black man running in the dark could be misinterpreted. He was 6'3" with shoulders built from years of carrying rucksacks, and he moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. He wasn't a man who panicked. He wasn't a man who stumbled. But tonight the routine had been shattered. 10 minutes earlier, the park had been quiet. Then came the splash. It wasn't the rhythmic slap of a fish jumping. It was the chaotic thrashing entry of someone who didn't know how to swim. Terrell had been stretching near the railing, his earbuds in, but the music low when he heard the choked cry. He didn't think. The military training dormant, but never gone, overrode the civilian hesitation. He saw the small head bobbing 20 feet out. A boy maybe 8 years old, panic etched into his flailing arms. Terrell didn't bother with his shoes. He vaulted the railing and hit the water. The Hillsborough River is deceptive. It looks placid, but the undercurrents are muscular and cold. Terrell fought the drag of his own clothes, his sneakers acting like lead weights as he stroked toward the boy. He swallowed a mouthful of brackish water, the taste of mud and oil filling his throat, but he reached the kid. The boy was in the stage of drowning where the fight turns into a silent sink. Terrell grabbed him by the back of his shirt, hauled him to the surface, and kicked hard for the embankment. The exit was ugly. There was no graceful ladder. Terrell had to heave the coughing, retching child up onto the muddy bank, scraping his own shins against the jagged rocks. He collapsed onto the grass, his lungs burning, his expensive running gear soaked and ruined. The boy, terrified and embarrassed, had scrambled up the slope the moment he caught his breath disappearing toward the parking lot, where a frantic group of adults was just starting to realize he was missing. Terrell didn't chase him. He didn't need a thank you. He just needed to breathe. He stood up, swaying slightly. The adrenaline dump was hitting him now, the sudden crash that leaves your hands shaking and your knees feeling like water. He was freezing. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and his wet clothes clung to him like a second freezing skin. He stumbled toward the paved path, his steps heavy and uncoordinated as his body tried to regulate its temperature. He wiped water from his eyes, blinking against the sting of the river muck. That was when the spotlight hit him. Officer Ethan Caldwell was 24 years old and 6 months into his solo patrols. He had a clean uniform, a high and tight haircut, and a belief that he could read the streets better than the veterans on the force. He was cruising the park perimeter, looking for the usual suspects, teenagers smoking weed, couples in parked cars, or the homeless population that sometimes drifted in from the downtown corridor. What Caldwell saw was not a hero recovering from a rescue. He saw a large, disheveled black man in soaking wet clothes, stumbling along the Riverwalk, looking confused and unstable. Caldwell didn't see the wet footprints leading from the riverbank. He didn't hear the distant commotion of the family in the parking lot. He saw a stereotype. He saw intoxicated. He saw vagrant. He saw a problem that needed to be neutralized. Caldwell slammed his cruiser into park and stepped out, leaving the door open. He didn't call out a greeting. He didn't ask if the man needed medical aid. He went straight to command voice. "Hey, you!" Caldwell barked, his hand resting instinctively near his belt. Terrell stopped. He was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering. He squinted into the cruiser's headlights, raising a hand to shield his eyes. I'm okay." Terrell managed his voice raspy from the river water. "Just catching my breath." Caldwell closed the distance, his stride aggressive. The body-worn camera on his chest was blinking green, buffering the pre-event recording, capturing the exact moment his bias took the wheel. "Look at you," Caldwell sneered, stopping 4 feet away. "Soaking wet and stumbling around. You drunk or just high, pal?" The question wasn't an inquiry. It was an accusation wrapped in a greeting. Terrell blinked, the absurdity of the question failing to register through the cold. He looked down at his own clothes, the water dripping from the hem of his athletic shorts, the squelch of his shoes on the pavement. "I just pulled a drowning kid out of that water," Terrell said, pointing a shaking finger toward the dark river. "Back off." It was the back off that triggered Caldwell. In his mind, citizens didn't give orders. Suspects gave resistance. Citizens gave compliance. "Yeah, save the hero story," Caldwell snapped, moving into Terrell's personal space. "Stop resisting and turn around." "I'm not resisting," Terrell said, his voice dropping an octave, the Marine Corps discipline fighting the physiological shock. "I'm catching my breath. Listen to me." "Done listening," Caldwell said. He reached out, grabbing Terrell's wrist with a grip that was meant to hurt. "Hands behind your back or you hit the ground." "Don't touch me," Terrell said, pulling his arm back reflexively. It wasn't a strike, it was a boundary. He was a man who had just saved a life, and now he was being assaulted by the very help that should have been checking his vitals. The interaction was deteriorating faster than Terrell could process. His body was in survival mode. Hypothermia was a real threat, and his brain was struggling to switch from rescue to defense. A few yards away, a woman in a beige windbreaker was walking her golden retriever. This was the friction point, the moment where the community could have intervened. But the woman, seeing a uniformed officer shouting at a stumbling black man, made the calculation that society had taught her. She didn't see the water. She saw the stumble. "Officer," she called out, pausing but keeping her distance. He does look really out of it. He almost fell over by the bench." Caldwell didn't look at her, but he nodded, accepting the validation. "I got it, ma'am. Step back." The witness had unintentionally fortified the officer's false narrative. To Caldwell, this was confirmation the suspect was intoxicated public and a nuisance. "Turn around," Caldwell commanded, again unclipping his taser, the yellow plastic weapon leveled at Terrell's chest. "Last warning." Terrell looked at the taser, then at Caldwell's eyes. He saw the glaze of adrenaline there, the tunnel vision that blocks out reason. Terrell knew that look. He had seen it on young privates in their first firefight. It was dangerous. "I am a veteran," Terrell said, enunciating clearly despite the shivering. "I am wet because I was in the river. Look at the water, officer. Just look at the damn water." Caldwell refused. To look at the water would be to entertain the possibility that he was wrong, and Caldwell was not in the mood to be wrong. He was in the mood to win. "I don't care about the water," Caldwell said. "I care about you swaying all over my park. Turn around." Terrell stood his ground. He didn't raise his hands, but he didn't attack. He employed the passive resistance of a man who knows his rights, but values his life. He locked his knees, breathing through his nose, trying to stop the shivering that Caldwell was interpreting as aggression. "I am not turning around until you tell me what crime I have committed," Terrell said. "Am I being detained?" "You're about to be tased," Caldwell promised. The standoff hung in the humid air, a fragile thread about to snap. The park was filling with the ambient noise of the city sirens in the distance, the hum of traffic on the boulevard, but inside this circle of light it was silent except for the crackle of Caldwell's radio. Then the dynamic shifted. It started with a phone light, then another. The parents of the drowning boy had not left. They had been near the parking lot toweling off their terrified son when the father, a mechanic named David, realized the man who had saved his son hadn't followed them up. David had run back toward the water, his wife Maria trailing him, clutching the boy's hand. They arrived just as Caldwell leveled the taser. They didn't just watch. They didn't just film. They became the wall. "Hey!" David yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. He was a heavy-set man panting from the run, but he didn't hesitate. He stepped onto the path 20 feet away, his phone already recording. "Put that away! He saved my son!" Caldwell flinched, his focus broken. He swung the taser slightly toward the new voice. "Back up! This is a police operation." "Operation?" Maria screamed, stepping up beside her husband. "He's wet because he jumped in the river. Look at him, he's freezing. The witness circle began to form. The woman with the dog, realizing her mistake, stopped and turned back. Two teenagers on skateboards who had been watching from the shadows rolled closer, their phones raised like shields. I saw him jump in. One of the teenagers said, his voice breaking the tension. I saw the splash, officer. He ain't drunk. Caldwell was surrounded by truth, but he was trapped in his own escalation. He had already committed to the use of force threat. To back down now in his mind was to lose authority. He refused a lawful order, Caldwell shouted, trying to talk over the growing crowd. I don't care what he did before. He's resisting now. Resisting what? Terrell asked, his voice gaining strength from the witnesses. Resisting your assumption. Caldwell stepped forward, holstering the taser, but grabbing his handcuffs. He lunged for Terrell, spinning him around with force that was entirely unnecessary. Terrell groaned as his shoulder, stiff from the swim, was wrenched back. You're under arrest, Caldwell spat. For what? David yelled from the sideline. For saving a kid? Disorderly conduct and resisting without violence. Caldwell recited the catch-all charges of a cop losing control of the narrative. The handcuffs clicked tight, too tight around Terrell's wrists. The metallic sound echoed like a gunshot in the park. Terrell didn't fight the cuffs. He knew the camera was rolling. He knew the witnesses were there. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the police cruiser, closing his eyes. He felt the humiliation burn hotter than the cold river water. He was a staff sergeant. He had led men through minefields. And now he was being treated like a criminal because he had dared to save a life while black. But the system wasn't done. The solidarity engine was revving up. David didn't stop recording. He walked right up to the caution tape Caldwell was mentally trying to string up. I want your badge number, David said clearly. I want a supervisor. Now? Call it in, Maria added, her voice fierce. We aren't leaving. Caldwell glared at them, but he knew he was boxed in. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, send a supervisor to my 20. I have a hostile crowd. Hostile! The teenager laughed, a sharp, cynical sound. We just telling the truth, bro. Terrell stood by the car water, pooling around his sneakers. He focused on his breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He needed to stay calm. If he reacted now, if he gave Caldwell even a twitch of aggression, the narrative would shift. He had to be perfect. 10 minutes passed. The cold was seeping into Terrell's bones. His teeth were chattering so hard his jaw ached. A second cruiser pulled up, no lights, just a heavy engine purr. Sergeant Reynolds stepped out. Reynolds was an older officer, thick around the middle, with the weary eyes of someone who had spent 30 years watching rookies make mistakes. He didn't walk with Caldwell's strut. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace. He looked at Caldwell. He looked at the crowd who were still filming. He looked at Terrell, shivering in handcuffs, water still dripping from his nose. What do we have? Reynolds asked, his voice low. Subject was stumbling, appeared intoxicated. Caldwell said, his voice tight. Refused to identify, refused to comply with orders. Resisted detention. Reynolds turned to Terrell. He didn't ask if he was drunk. He asked the question a human being asks. Son, why are you wet? I pulled that boy out of the river, Terrell stammered, nodding toward Maria's son, who was clinging to her leg. About 20 minutes ago. Reynolds looked at Maria. She nodded vigorously. He saved his life, officer. My son slipped. This man jumped in. He didn't hesitate. Reynolds looked at the river. He saw the disturbed mud on the bank. He saw the slide marks. He looked back at Caldwell. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the sound of a career hitting a wall. Uncuff him, Reynolds said. Sergeant, he resisted. Caldwell started. Uncuff him, Reynolds repeated, the volume not rising, but the temperature dropping. Now! Caldwell's jaw tightened. He pulled the key from his belt. He unlocked the cuffs. Terrell brought his hands forward, rubbing his wrists. The circulation rushed back, painful and hot. Medical is en route, Reynolds asked Caldwell. I didn't call them, Caldwell admitted. Reynolds stared at him. You have a subject who is submerged in river water showing signs of hypothermia, and you put him in cuffs instead of an ambulance. I thought he was on drugs, Caldwell said, clinging to the lie. You thought wrong, Reynolds said. He turned to Terrell. Sir, ambulance is on the way. I apologize for the delay. We're going to get you a blanket. Reynolds went to his trunk. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick wool emergency blanket and draped it over Terrell's shoulders. I need your ID when you're ready, Reynolds said gently. But first, let's get you warm. Then Reynolds did the thing that separates the bureaucrats from the leaders. He pulled out his notepad. I need statements, Reynolds announced to the crowd. Everyone who saw what happened, I want it on record right now. Sergeant Reynolds didn't argue with the witnesses. He didn't tell them to put their phones away. He treated them as evidence. He wrote down David's account. He wrote down the teenager's account. He took Maria's contact info. This was the institutional backbone kicking in. The system, often slow and defensive, was being forced into correction by the undeniable weight of the evidence and the presence of a supervisor who refused to play along with the blue wall of silence. Caldwell stood by his cruiser isolated. The green light on his body camera was still blinking, recording his supervisor dismantling his probable cause piece by piece. Officer Caldwell. Reynolds said, not looking up from his notepad, "Go sit in your car." Sarge, car, now. The humiliation was complete. Caldwell retreated to the driver's seat, the safety of his glass bubble, now a prison. Terrell sat on the bench wrapped in the blanket. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later checking his vitals. His temperature was low, his heart rate high, but he was stable. David came over extending a hand. "I don't know your name, man, but thank you. You saved my boy." "Terrell," he said, shaking the hand. "Terrell Anderson." "Terrell," David repeated. "We got it all on video. He isn't getting away with this." The fallout wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. The video didn't just stay on David's phone, it went online. The image of a wet, shivering black man in handcuffs with the caption, "Hero arrested for saving life," went viral before the sun came up the next morning. The Tampa Police Department couldn't spin it. The visual evidence was too stark. The duality of the dual viral spark was undeniable here, was a man performing the ultimate act of citizenship, risking his life for a stranger being treated as a threat by the state. 3 days later, the press conference was held, but it wasn't the usual defensive posturing. The chief of police stood at the podium. "The actions of Officer Caldwell were inconsistent with our training and our values," the chief said. "We have initiated an internal affairs investigation." But Terrell Anderson didn't just want an investigation. He wanted change. He hired a civil rights attorney who specialized in Fourth Amendment violations. They didn't just sue for the arrest. They sued for the pattern of practice that allowed an officer to look at a wet man near a river and see a criminal instead of a victim. The payoff path, PP2, began to materialize. First came the public apology. A written retraction of the arrest record was issued within the week. The charges never formally filed but present in the arrest log were expunged with prejudice. Then came the personnel changes. Officer Ethan Caldwell was placed on administrative leave. Then, as the investigation revealed a pattern of similar aggressive stops, he was terminated. It wasn't a transfer, it was a firing. Sergeant Reynolds was commended for his intervention, a signal to other supervisors that stopping a bad arrest was as important as making a good one. But the real victory was the settlement. The city, desperate to avoid a jury trial where they would have to explain why a hero was handcuffed, settled for $5.6 million. Terrell Anderson didn't quit his job. He didn't move. He took a portion of the money and started a foundation for swimming safety in underserved communities. He paid for lessons. He paid for gear. 6 months later, Terrell was back at Lowry Park. It was evening. The air was heavy. He laced up his new running shoes. He adjusted his high-visibility vest. He stopped by the railing where he had jumped. The water was calm. A patrol car rolled by. The officer inside slowed down. It was a new guy. He waved. Terrell didn't wave back. He just nodded. Acknowledgement, not friendship. He checked his watch, took a breath, and started to run. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was running because he could. This story highlights a critical breakdown in what we call situational awareness in policing. Officer Caldwell failed to scan the environment, the water, the footprints, the witnesses, and instead relied on a biased heuristic that labeled Terrell a threat. It also shows the power of the active bystander. The witnesses who stayed filmed and spoke up didn't physically fight the police. They provided the social friction that made it impossible for the officer to operate in the dark. First, if you witness an interaction like this, remember the safe distance clear angle rule. Stand far enough back that you cannot be accused of interfering, usually 15 to 20 feet, but close enough to capture audio, which is often more important than video. Next narration is powerful. Like the witnesses in the story, calmly stating, "He is not resisting," or "He just saved a child," creates a real-time record that is hard to dispute later. Third, never physically intervene or touch an officer, as this creates a legal justification for them to use force against you. Use your voice and your presence instead. Fourth, wait for the supervisor. Requesting a white shirt or a sergeant is a valid bystander action that brings a second set of eyes to the scene. Finally, if you are the victim, prioritize your physical safety over your pride in the moment. State your rights, clearly do not consent to searches, but do not offer physical resistance that can be used to justify escalation. Some elements are selectively fictionalized for education.